there's a lot of things that prompt me to go into this field. I'm not a physician or nor a psychologist, but I'm really interested starting from my personal history of just being so anxious, being so unable to sort of manage my own mood from road rage to anxiety associated with work performance to ultimately depression in 2020 because of everything that was happening around us.
Welcome to Peak Human Labs, where I share amazing interviews with incredible human beings who are leaders in how to optimize your health and get you to peak mental, physical, and mental state. My name is Dr. Sanjeev Goyal. I'm a physician for the past 20 years, specializing in longevity, precision medicine, and biohacking. And my mission is to alleviate the suffering we all face and will encounter when dealing with illness, sadness, and loss. And to this end, I'm sharing these conversations with people who can shed light on how to live more purposefully and intentionally so that you can be inspired and create your own path to wellness and fulfillment. Okay, so today we're going to be talking with Alex Nee from Divergence Neuro. We're going to be learning all about brain waves and how you can measure your brain waves, how you can train your brain waves, and get your brain into optimal form. Let's see you on the other side, and I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Hey, Alex, how are you? Thanks for
Hi,
joining
Sanjeev.
us.
I'm doing well, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So today we want to learn everything about neurobiofeedback. You have a lot of experience in this area. Do you want to just tell our audience, our viewers, a little bit about your background, how you got into this space, and why you're doing this work?
Sure. My background is in computer software and computer engineering. So I started out as a software developer many years ago
Mm-hmm.
for major technology companies, and throughout my career, developed many business software systems, mostly focused on mobile media space and cloud space with machine learning and AI. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a little bit about me. So I got started in this neurofeedback and biofeedback journey. It was actually quite an interesting uh, somewhat coincidental story, right about middle of 2020, mid-pandemic, first lockdown. My mental health just deteriorated precipitously as we're all going into lockdown. 12-hour Zoom calls and layoffs and things like that really got to a point where I questioned a lot about why I'm doing what I'm doing and whether this is sort of my journey. And the thing about me is, before that job that I held, which is pretty high up in sort of corporate technology, I actually ran a startup using brainwaves and AI machine learning to help understand and measure and detect epileptic seizures. So that was quite some years ago, and during that experience, I had a collaborator that was very interested in using some of this mobile EEG systems or brainwave acquisition systems to do, uh, neuro wellness, neurofeedback kind of treatment and modality for patients. So by summer of 2020, she gave me a call and said, "Look, we've got a lot of challenges here, working with patients because traditionally they'd come in my clinic and we'd, hook them up on these clinical devices that are very large and very expensive, and it'll be full cap with gel and wires coming out. Clinic is locked down right now. No one can come. So, people are becoming very dysregulated. And I'm like, I hear you. And, there's a lot of need out there, and we can't seem to really address it because style of me driving around was a suitcase in my car and hooking people up in their garages. There's just no other way of doing it. She says, well, can you create something that is mobile and can enable at-home training? I said, possibly, why not? So that's kind of how we got started in this whole remote neurofeedback journey.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just take a step back and try to sort of sift out what neurofeedback is. So, neurofeedback is an intervention modality for mental health wellness training modality that uses the brainwaves as kind of a guiding compass to help people achieve a higher state of self-regulation. So, this
Mm-hmm.
uses the brainwave as a metric to change these feedback. They could be videos or audios or sound or even video games that basically generate a desirable experience to get your brain to sort of go into this desirable state and produce more desirable frequencies of brain waves as opposed to undesirable ones. So,
Hmm.
gets you to sort of understand how to learn certain skills of self-regulation. And then by reinforcing them repeatedly, those kind of states that you learn during exercise become traits through operant conditioning. So that's sort of the fundamental at 10,000 feet level
Hmm.
of what neural and biofeedback are,
Let's
right? So, yeah.
let's take even a further back step just to talk about even what are brain waves. So basically, the brain is like an electrical device, I assume. Is that correct? Would
Indeed.
that be, is that a
Indeed.
good way to describe it? And so that waves are, they're basically an amplitude and a frequency. Is that correct? And our brain produces many of these types of signals. Is that how would you
Yes.
describe what brain waves are, and
Well,
what are
what
the different brain waves? And you know.
everything you just said is correct. So the brain is first and foremost a large electrical organ. So we break it down to the biology of it. It's billions of these neurons with dendrites that are expanding into this complex infused network. So there's lots of these neurons that are giving off electrons all the time. At different frequencies. So, as you mentioned, that there's frequencies in terms of how often or how fast or slow these electrons are being given off by large groups of neurons, and then there's amplitude, how high the voltage is, the sort of electrical activities, how many neurons are firing together. That kind of speaks to the amplitude. So if you were to look at a real wave, amplitude is like how high is the wave, and the frequency is like how fast is it rippling, right? So
Hmm.
um,
And is the
measuring
brain working all in concert, or you're, I think different areas of the brain are having different frequencies, or like what exactly is happening there?
so different brain areas definitely give out different frequencies, and what kind of frequencies or how high the amplitude depends on the task or the environment or the context that the brain is undergoing. So if a brain is at rest, you might see slower frequencies like alpha or even theta. When the brain is busy or engaged, you will see different areas, specifically frontal cortex, giving off higher frequencies or faster waves like beta or even gamma, right? So it all
Hmm.
depends, but different areas tend to work together through some tasks to achieve a more complex goal, as most organisms do.
How does it compare? Let's say we're doing a busy, cognitive work. That's a beta wave, and if we're sleeping, is that a theta wave? Like, how does? Can you just give us some like breakdown of the different waves and where we normally see them?
The measurable brain waves or topically measurable brain waves are usually broken down in sort of 4 to 5 different spectrums. It starts with the lowest being delta, which is when you're in deep sleep, right?
Okay.
So the brain goes into fairly relaxed kind of standby mode or offline mode where you see slower modulation of waves. This means the neurons aren't quite as excited. They're giving off electrons in large groups in a much slower pace than they would otherwise, if you're awake. And above that would be the theta waves. The theta wave is kind of interesting in between subconscious waves. So you see a lot of theta naturally in people who are just waking up. So you just open your eyes in the morning, you're not fully alert yet, and you kind of, in this sort of semi drowsy slash dreamy state.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also interesting to mention that theta also comes up when the brain enters into rest and repair stage. So when you're meditating,
Mm-hmm.
it's one instance where you can see a lot of theta being generated in posterior or temporal regions of the brain, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
still a slower wave, but it's pretty important wave frequency to tap into subconscious thoughts and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, synchronization. Right above that would be alpha, so that's between 8 to 12 hertz. So alpha is one of the most interesting frequencies. So it really is, studied quite extensively through the history of neurophysiology, and it's first measured by people who are closing their eyes, entering into an internally focused state, right? So our eyes are connected to intracranial visual nerves that terminates at our occipital lobe, which is this big area in the back of our brain that processes visual information, right? So when your eyes are closed, there's no visual information to process. Most healthy, normal brains tend to generate excessive alpha in comparison to when their eyes are open. So that indicates a state of internal focus and relaxation of, of the brain. Because with no visual feed, there's no environmental data to process. So the brain kind of goes into a more standby state rather than, completely offline or completely engaged. So alpha is one of the strongest frequencies. So you see a lot of alpha in terms of amplitude, right? Um, and then above that, you have the beta range, which is the widest frequency range. It goes from 13 hertz all the way to 30 hertz. It's typically broken down into three sub ranges, being low beta or SMR, sensory motor rhythm, which is 12 to 15, mid beta 15 to 20, usually related to intense cognitive processing, and then high beta, which is generally speaking 20 to 30 hertz, typically related to excitability and overvigilance in some clinical
Mm.
cases. And then the last and fastest frequency band above beta is called gamma. So these are anything that's above 30 hertz all the way to, let's say, 100 hertz, which is a measurable range for most topical surface EEG devices, right?
Where would you see a gamma?
Gamma is typically associated with hyperconcentration and higher levels of association activities between memory and consciousness. So you see gamma, for example, in intense experienced meditators going into sort of meditative state or transcendental meditation.
Mm.
There are lots of studies back in, all the way back into the 70s of Zen Buddhist monks being measured with EEG devices when they go into, kind of a Kriya state where they have a lot of different high frequency component that are quite unique from average EEG distribution. It's associated with higher activities, higher order activities in the brain.
Okay. So you mentioned
Mhm.
earlier that you also see theta waves as well in meditators, but I assume that there's some type of graduation. Like it's not maybe one starts off in theta, ends up as you're more experienced into gamma. Is that how you might describe it?
In a way, yes. So, I think it's important to understand that like the brain never produces really just a single frequency. So when you look at a complex waveform, as any waveforms, such as sound or light or magnetic waveforms, you can decompose that into many different spectrums. So the
Mm-hmm.
brain can produce beta and gamma at the same time. So
Mm.
there's coupling between different frequency activities when the brain enters into interesting and unique states like a meditative state, right? So there's lower carrier waves that are more predominant, from an amplitude point of view. Those could be delta or theta, and then some of the higher activity that's less predominant in terms of amplitude that could be gamma. But generally speaking, the higher the frequency, the lower the amplitude, but you can still look at the
Mm.
presence and relative change in each frequency band. So what changes is the percentage of that frequency or the power that your brain generates in a specific frequency, kind of indicates where your brain is hanging out at. So if I'm
Mm.
producing a lot more gamma than I normally would, my brain is spending time hanging out of that very hyper concentrated, hyper associative consciousness,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
state rather than a normal baseline state where you see very little gamma, right? But you can see theta all the same, underlying. So it's rather a mixture of different frequency ranges.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about measurement. I mean, basically, I guess the measurement of brainwaves is really an EEG. Is that correct? Is this how?
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And you said you started off with looking at epilepsy, which is how we would normally be diagnosing epilepsy with an EEG. How did this whole science move into start looking at brainwaves for other types of issues, not seizures per se? Like, how did this whole field move?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question. If I may share a few slides that
Sure, that'd
used
be
to
great.
summarize the movement of biofeedback and specifically neurofeedback being a subsector of that. So
Mm-hmm.
I've done a little sort of high-level summary you can see in the slide. It's called History of Neurofeedback. There's really, as I mentioned, there, mystics and yogis being studied all the way back to 1950s. Here you see Dr. Elmer Green
Right.
measuring brain waves and heart rate of a meditating yogi by the side of Ganges. You can see the wires that
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Green had, in a laptop, probably somewhere on the side, or on amplifier equipments that
Mm-hmm.
record these electrical activities coming from various part of the body, not just the brain per se, but obviously the heart rate and, electrodermal responses or other physiological signs. He wanted to understand when these mystics go into an altered state of consciousness, such as meditation, what
Mm-hmm.
happens to various biosigns, brainwaves being part of that, of course. And this was done all the way back in the 1950s. And from the 50s onwards, you've got very experimental physiologists or scientists such as Joe Kamiya, was really a huge contributor and pillar to the entire neurophysiology industry, who discovered alpha waves in response to feedback. So this really is the theoretical foundation of neurofeedback, because someone back in late 50s discovered, wow, we can actually influence how much alpha has been produced by shifting the subject into different state with feedback intervention, right? And then in the middle of
Mm-hmm.
1960s, we have Dr. M. Barry Sturman, who discovered the role of sensory motor rhythm, which is the frequency that's right above alpha, in terms of training cats to be more resilient, against epileptic seizures, as a consequence of exposing a bunch of cats into tetrazine, which is part of the space fuel. So they wanted to understand this because they're trying to develop a training program for
Mm-hmm.
astronauts as part of the
Mm-hmm.
space project for them to become more resilient. And the sad part of this is, dozens of poor cats basically sacrificed their lives for us to discover that when we train, cats' brain in a certain way, um, in this slide over here, they can actually learn to produce this SMR, sensory motor rhythm, and in turn, when they're in this hyper focused state and they get rewarded in the form of food or image of a mouse, they become sort of focused but calm. So what we call the state is kind of a poised state. So
Is
this
that
is
what
this is
SMR is? What's SMR? Sorry, I don't know what that means.
Oh, sorry, I should have explained that. SMR stands for sensory motor rhythm, or
Okay.
sensory motor region, depends on the topic you're talking about. So in this context, it's sensory motor rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So it is specifically referring to a frequency between 12 hertz and 15 hertz. So in other words, right above the alpha range, or
It's like a
hanging out
flow
with the.
state, or what? How would you describe this? What happens in this SMR state?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned flow, because I think the original observation when the cats are trained to produce more SMR frequency, um, the word that was been thrown around to describe these cats is poise. So in other words, they're focused but calm. So imagine a cat when it's just about to pounce. It's got its eyes on a target. It's calm. It's not moving around because it doesn't want to scare the target away. It's just kind of, doing its thing, but it's in a prey mode, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of focused but calm in order to maintain maximum agility, and sensory acuity, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
reason that it's called sensory motor rhythm, it's because it's originally discovered around the sensory motor region, which is just behind the prefrontal frontal cortex region. So it's sort of like around the middle of your brain. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where it's got its name from. Though you can see this waveform other areas of the brain, it's just not quite as predominant. So the
Mm-hmm.
reason why the cats are in these poised states is because it apparently gave them elevated sense of accuracy, somatic agility, and mental acuity, which, as you can imagine, is pretty crucial when it comes to getting that mouse right. Because
Mm-hmm.
so when an animal is in hunt, they kind of enter into these sort of soft, relaxed but focused state.
And when do humans
So
enter into these states?
um, uh, all sorts of different situations. When you take a swing in your golf club,
Mm.
you want to kind of feel that focus. You've got your eyes on a ball, but you practice your motion thousands of times, hopefully, before you step on the tee. And when you execute, it's just one fell smooth, like smooth motion. It's not overthinking, it's not overvigilance, it's not asleep or relaxed either. It's somewhere in between. So this is, I think you're right. It can be translated to loosely somewhat of a flow state, right? So you're really kind of focused while maintaining the sense of calm.
Mm.
So that's
Okay.
how I would describe it. So what's interesting beyond the state is what happened to these cats afterwards. So Sturman's experiments involved training a bunch of cats, 20, 30 sessions in a row over the span of, a month, 2 months. So after repeating the state so many times, he then put the cats in a controlled trial. So he exposed them to tetrazine. That's the space fuel. That's the terrible part. So, to the surprise of everyone, the cats that were trained to produce more sensor motor rhythm, or the SMR frequency, had developed robust sort of resistance towards tetrazine. So they did not develop seizure, and the cats that were trained with just sham or just random frequencies did develop seizure, and all of them passed away as a consequence of that. So that's how, there was this first glimpse of something interesting there, because Dr. Stearman basically said, well, look, if this works for cats, I wonder if it worked for people too. So he took epileptic patients and was healthy control, blinded them, and proceeded to use a similar design to train them, to sort of do SMR based training. And not surprisingly, that the patients who are trained with real SMR up protocols developed resistance towards seizures. They've seen significant reduction of seizure occurrences post training. So,
Wow.
this is the first empirical evidence where,
Hmm.
we can train using state manipulation and shift, and the benefit will translate then into somewhat a trait, which is seizure resistance, meaning that it still works when you're not training. Right.
Does this training to SMR also benefit other clinical conditions or only seizures?
No, so this is where things get even more interesting.
Hmm.
So, Jim Hart and Joe Kamiya continue to study, alongside of Sturman, and, their applications start developing. And I think, one of the things that uh, continued being studied in the human physiology is the production of SMR, you know, benefit the stabilization of medial frontal cortex, kind of like cingulate region or anterior frontal cortex, to stabilize thought patterns, to improve focus, to improve regulatory functions of the medial frontal parts of our brain, right? So, this has implications to a bunch of things, not just seizures. For instance, things like regulatory control, which is crucial for resilience against things like addiction or impulsivity, right? So when somebody is addicted or they're impulsive, typically the physiological underlying reasons are that their regulatory functions can be compromised. Certain
Hmm.
groups of neurons fail to, activate to a degree to intervene impulsive thoughts or addiction loops, right? So
Hmm.
when that regulatory failure occurs, the person is a victim to, sort of these thoughts being kind of overwhelmed or short-circuited, and then they jump into action, right? So there's the physiological aspect of addiction or impulsivity that can be traced back to, um, training that are related to SMR, as well as other frequencies, of course. But
So you're saying that like a lower amount of SMR could cause one to be more likely to have addiction, or the opposite way?
it's more the opposite. So it's
The opposite. Okay.
correlation. Yeah, it's correlation rather than causation, right? So when
Yeah.
we look at what a compromised brain looks like, so remember, EEG is just a signal coming from the brain that indicates there may be a problem,
Hmm.
rather than, because you have lower SMR, you're sort more susceptible to addiction. It's a sign or a marker, rather,
Right. Right.
of
Is
sort of underlying issues. The underlying issues could be, neuron activation levels being lower than what is
mm-hmm.
required to inhibit certain impulses from a
Mm-hmm.
neuroscience point of view. So yeah, it's a way for us to look into how the brain actually functions. And when we train, we say we train high rate SMR, meaning we tie it to a reward to essentially coax the brain into producing more of SMR, for example. Right. So in the case of the cats, you give them food, uh, or you show them nice imagery of mice or fish, something they're interested in to hold their attention. So as their attention holds, their brain naturally produces this kind of rhythmic wave that's in this frequency range as an indicator that they're in this sort of relaxed and engaged state, right?
So I think I just wanted to make that clear. Our viewers understand this. So basically, you the training is providing them something that they would like to have happen, and
Correct.
to make it kind of happen, they have to put their brain within the desired frequency. Is that correct? Is that how you would describe it? Is that what
Yes,
the training sounds like?
precisely.
Okay, it's
Yes,
operant. This
it's
is what the operant training conditioning is. Is that what that means? I'm sorry, I'm not.
precisely. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, operant conditioning was discovered by B.F. Skinner in sort of like psychology, where it boils down to something like you give a mouse a piece of cheese.
Hmm.
Every time they press the lever,
Hmm.
soon the mouse will associate pressing of the lever, which is the action here, to the
Right.
outcome of obtaining that cheese. So viewers who are familiar with machine learning might understand this as supervised training where you have this outcome and a sigma layer that when the code does something to get that outcome, it gets rewarded so that weights increase inside the layer to favor this kind of action versus other actions. So that is because that's how neural networks work with inside of a brain.
And it's not that the subject, like in this case, the mouse or potentially even the human, doesn't even know that the training is happening. Is that correct? I mean, they're not really saying, okay, we want to get into this particular frequency. That's operant means that it's being tied to some other cue or something.
That is correct. Yes. So operant conditioning happens in a sort of non-cognitive level. So the mouse is not thinking, wow, I've got to devise this intricate scheme to get that cheese. It knows
Hmm.
when it presses the lever
Right.
through learning the first time that the cheese appears and does that a few more times.
Hmm.
And so long as, most of the times when it presses the lever, the cheese appears, it then encodes the appearance of the cheese was the action of pressing the lever. That's essentially how operant conditioning works. So if you
Hmm.
want a real life example, just think slot machines. Very
Hmm.
visceral, kind of parallel to the mouse pressing the cheese, where instead of the mouse, you got the human pulling the lever, and most of the times the human wings something in an initial phase, and then the brain learns, okay, when I pull the lever more than 50% of the time, I'm going to get more than what I put in. So that's a win. That's a good thing. And then it starts developing this habit. And what happens after is you're addicted to slots, right? So,
Hmm.
so that's how they get you in a casino. That actually, is the first commercial application of operant conditioning.
Okay, that's very interesting. Just, I know it's a little tangent, but what is the success rate that you need for it to become that the brain would say, okay, this is worth keep going? Like, let's say, how many winnings do you need to have? What percentage for pulling the lever to keep going? Do we have some
Right
science
down
on
to
that?
business. I love it. It's yeah. So the consensus seems to be from the Skinner school of operant conditioning psychology, 65 to 70% during what is known as the acquisition phase, right?
Ah,
So when
okay.
you're acquiring a skill, you want to get this idea through the brain that when you do something, more than likely you're going to
Hmm.
get that positive rewards. That's how the brain learns on a physiological level. That's how neurons get wired together is through stimuli based conditioning.
Hmm.
So 70% tends to be the generally agreed upon. 65 to 70% tends to be the generally agreed upon
Hmm. Hmm.
starting point of a positive reward ratio, right?
It's a good idea if you're trying to acquire some new type of learning that to give yourself some good winnings at the beginning, at least 70%,
Indeed.
65, so that you
Yeah.
can form a positive reward cycle.
That's right. That's
Mm.
right. And if you think back and how humans learn anything, success always motivates continued investment into learning, right? So if I'm
Mm-hmm.
failing miserably at something, when I start learning like coding, I'm not likely going to continue because that doesn't feel very good, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's that negative versus positive reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you start with a positive reinforcement, it start developing a habituated motivation or sense to do that thing, continue onwards to learn more. This kind of brings us to generalization, which is the second phase of operant conditioning. So when you have developed the sense that I'm going to keep pressing the lever, and most times the cheese will show, or the
Mm-hmm.
money in terms of a human, guess what? You're going back to that lever. That's how you generalize this learning. You say, I know how to do this thing and I want to do it because I get that positive reinforcement. Most of the time, what casinos do in the second phase is, what they do? They dial down a winning rate.
It's too late because you've already built in that conditioning, so it's too late to kind of make some changes to that.
That's precisely correct. Yeah. So they hook you with the learning and then they apply generalizations. So they will dial down a winning rate first to about random, which is 50%, and then
Mm-hmm.
below random. So, your neural network has already built strong correlation between reward and activity.
Mm-hmm.
Even when the reward starts changing, you're still producing the same kind of action as a
Mm-hmm.
consequence.
There could be some value to potentially changing slot machines and like starting new slot machines because at the beginning they might.
Yeah. Here's a new business idea.
I know. So I mean, so basically, you've taken this knowledge about how the brain learns and trains, and then applied it for good in this situation with neurobiofeedback. And so maybe take us through what's next. Yeah. Okay. Let's do that.
100%. So, perfect segue, thank you. And so, exactly what we want to do is to apply that conditional paradigm and the
Mm-hmm.
technique for good. And the good is defined in a sense that we can teach ourselves, we can teach other people tools of self-regulation. So if you do A, you will get B as a state shift reward, right? So reward is defined as anything that's desirable, more calmness, more focus, less anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
less addictive behavior or self-destructive behavior. These are all loosely defined as the good or the reward. So the proverbial cheese here. So, you start with understanding what kind of state you're in. And a lot of times, this goes back to things like meditation, breathing exercises, exercise. Um, a lot of people are just not so great at building that awareness between their internal state, in terms of how things are looking inside their brain and associating that to how they're feeling, right, the outcome, right? So EEG, as many other things, serves as a tool or a kind of GPS guidance, if you will. Um, really kind of brings to the foreground what kind of state our brain is in. So, for instance, if we're over vigilant or anxious or just really frazzled, we see a lot of high beta activity that is always kind of correlated back to high level of neuron activities in certain regions. So we can translate that to some kind of lever. Of course, not a physical one, but kind of like a proverbial lever in terms of dimming the screen or taking away the reward of that beautiful soundscape that you're enjoying. So it's a cue that we issue to the brain to say, hey, you're off track. Bring it back and stop thinking about that meeting later afternoon. Let's just spend the time here to work on your brain, right? So that's one way of getting somebody to establish a state of consciousness, right? So
Mm-hmm.
uh, we sense the control is not a brainwave itself, but the state of consciousness, the concentration of subtle existential cues. So this is real important because what we're really developing is not some sort of superpower, but an awareness of where our brain and bodies are at any given time, right? So when you establish that awareness,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, I'm entering into an overvigilant, frustrated, frazzled mode. I'm going to self-interrupt. It starts with this awareness. It's kind of like a guardrail mechanism.
Do you think this being done consciously or this done unconsciously? Like, because I'm just wondering now, are you saying that people who are able to are actually aware of which brainwave they're in?
No, I don't think that that's the kind of consciousness that we'll be counting on. I think as you're starting, the assumption is somewhat that, they're associating the experience with a state. So they're doing so unconsciously because you're not thinking about, okay, how much alpha am I producing or high beta am
Mm-hmm.
I producing? Rather, you know, how much of that sound can I hear and how do I feel at this moment? Do I feel in my body? Or am I feeling like everything's coming at me at once and I don't know, which thing to focus on, right? So you're really
Mm-hmm.
associating a state, which
Mm-hmm.
is something that's a felt sense, to an outcome, which is, how bright is that screen, or, you know, uh, how much of that
Mm-hmm.
beautiful soundscape I'm hearing, or is the dial moving fast enough on the screen? So you're kind of establishing this correlation that's somewhat visual, auditory, or haptic. So then, it starts encoding your brain with this sort of correlation, and you start developing this awareness. So every time, my screen goes down, I know my mind's going off track, and I'm thinking about that meeting later this afternoon or the big presentation I've got on Friday, versus, being in my body and focusing on my breathing and doing what I'm supposed to do to
Mm-hmm.
re-regulate my autonomous nervous system or cognitive nervous system. So it's really about building that awareness. So it serves as a
Mm-hmm.
guideline. For runners or people who work out in the gym, you can obviously work out with no instruments, but a lot of us choose to work out with a heart rate monitor. Why?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That it's not that heart rate monitors give you superhuman capability when it comes to workout. It gives you an
Mm-hmm.
awareness of where you are, right? So
Mm-hmm.
with that awareness, you can then make conscious decisions or adjustments. Do I go harder? Do I keep pace?
Okay.
Or do I back off? That's more or less the purpose of, using instruments and tools like Brainwave.
Mm-hmm. But you hear about yogis who can regulate their heart rate like
Indeed, yeah.
consciously. So is it possible to then? I mean, it's probably possible to then change your brainwave state. Is it not with enough
Absolutely.
practice? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If that weren't possible, the entire, foundation of neurofeedback would be completely false, right? So
Right.
it's possible because of neuroplasticity, and most of us understand that when we learn something and rehabituate ourselves, we
Mm-hmm.
change how the underlying neurophysical structure works, or neural network are fused to respond to the same external stimuli, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I can train myself to not get ragey in traffic. As a matter of fact, I have this neurofeedback. You ever drive on a Gardner, and then when you hit the certain cutoffs and you're just like, oh my God, why did they design it that way? And it's like
Yeah.
infuriating. But then when you get the sense of state shift, you can learn tools to interrupt yourself and say, hey, doesn't matter
Mm.
how you feel about this, it's gonna be here. You're gonna get through it. It's fine. And then you start doing things like pattern breathing, or
Mm-hmm.
self-soothing activities to not get ragey on a road. I mean, that's a classic
Mm-hmm.
example that I have personal experience with.
I've tried out, some of the training, and so, for example, you had to make a flame, brighter or something like that, which maybe changed my brainwaves in that moment, and I was trained to like, okay, make a flame brighter. But how does that then translate to a car cutting me off? Why would that be related?
When you repeatedly do the same state shift training with conscious awareness of how that associates with how you're feeling, that's when state develops into trait. This is
Ah.
generalization. Um, so when neurons fire together, wire together, so
Mm-hmm.
it's a classic because it is really true. It's when you repeat certain skills during
Mm-hmm.
learning so many times in a span of time, it becomes sort of developed, and that's when state develops into trait. That's what translates to, when you're on a 401 or,
Mm-hmm.
DVP or Gardner, you got that same traffic jam that you get every day driving down
Mm-hmm.
those roads, but
Mm-hmm.
you can choose to utilize those skills that are at this point generalized. So you don't have a brainwave thing in front of you. You're focusing on a road,
Mm-hmm.
but you know how to call those tools out to self-regulate by, doing certain things or thinking certain imageries or playing certain mental tricks to calm yourself down, or in my
Mm-hmm.
case, rhythmic breathing. So you can invoke those tools that are generalized because they're in your repertoire, right? So you've learned
Mm-hmm.
them. So you don't need the EEG anymore, nor the heart rate monitor. once you're an experienced meditator or once you've
Hmm.
been trained with neurofeedback in a correct way, you've
Hmm.
generalized that learning. And so those tools are yours and you can use them whenever
Hmm.
you want.
One just has to make conscious decision to use them,
That's
right?
correct. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I would say conscious decision and then, the ability to call out those tools to evoke them in a way that is part of a skill through repetition. Right? So you don't want to be
Hmm.
like finding your headband. You're sitting in traffic. You're not going to put your headband on and open up
No.
an app, and that's just not going to happen. But instead, if it's a generalized skill, you're going to okay, this is how I feel when I do this meditation. I'm going to call part of that memory out and steer my brain towards that state of calmness.
Hmm.
Not
Hmm.
complete disassociation because you'd be in trouble, especially if you're in traffic,
For
but
sure.
calm focus, kind of
Hmm.
like the cat, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so that's how those things kind of tie together. Yeah.
Hmm. All right. So let's talk about like some of your experience about how people have benefited from this type of training, neurobiofeedback training. That would be really, I think, really interesting.
There's a lot of things that prompt me to go into this field. I'm not
Yeah.
a physician or
Hmm.
nor a psychologist, but I'm really interested starting from my personal history of just being so anxious, being so unable to sort of manage my own mood from road rage to anxiety associated with work performance to ultimately depression in 2020
Mm.
because of everything that was happening around us, while we're on calls for 12 hours a day looking at spreadsheets. So all those things kind of exposed this need within myself, and looking outside of myself for a little bit. This is the U.S. mental health data from 2020 to 2023. You see anxiety, ADHD, and depression were the three top gainers. Respectively, it was 50%, 200%, and 300% rise across those 3 years. So, 4 out of 5 people who are afflicted with some of these conditions cannot get effective help or even be seen by a professional. So this is really not great. Traditional methods of talking and drugs have their limitations. And those are the two top things that we do. If you're suffering from mental health challenges, it's either talk therapy or some kind of drug that you're put on if you're going to see a psychiatrist. Evidence-based treatments are effective, but really, really not scalable because they're hooking people up on large amplifiers that can only be put in an office or something like that. So you know, when we look at the cost of the mental health system, it's really staggering, right? So we're spending collectively, nearly $50 billion on drugs every year between the four largest category of drugs, and there's all these barriers that we haven't even managed to get our hands around in terms of how to solve the scale, to help people heal faster using other physiological means that don't involve drugs. Um, so, when I looked at the challenges, I said, well, there are certain methods that really work, like neurofeedback and biofeedback on specific conditions such as anxiety, um, you know, anxiety-related addiction, overvigilance, depression, ADHD, these kind of self-regulation related problems. So, you know, can we use technology to create a solution where we can proliferate, we can make access to these solutions easier, more user friendly, more flexible, so somebody can do these exercises with guidance of data, good data, right from the comfort of their home, with a clinician or a therapist or professional on their side to guide them through this sort of intentional part of that journey, right? So the answer is yes, yes, we can. So in the last 4 years, I've led a team of engineers, therapists, researchers, customer support professionals in this sort of therapeutic business and wellness business to create a flexible, multi-device, multi-model neurodigital platform. It's known as Divergence. So we can do assessment, we can do protocol creation, we can do neurofeedback remotely, connecting the patients and their therapists, anywhere around the world for fraction of what used to be the cost of being able to do this reliably in the clinic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So neurofeedback is a very powerful modality of intervention. So a lot of the open label studies as well as control studies has suggested not only is it effective to produce results, in a short span of time, things like depression, anxiety, and ADHD, in most cases, a lot of those changes are sustainable so that they hold over time, right? This is a big deal because this means that we, alongside of talk therapy and drugs, have, you know, alternatives or at least sort of adjunctive interventions that can be applied in order to help people get better results without any kind of side effects or reliance or anything like that, such as in the case for drugs. So you can really scale the benefit of this kind of practice that's based on self-development, based on resilience development, and this dovetails well into the medical aspects of treatment and intervention, right? So the way I see it is, it's not one or the other. It's how do we work together to develop internal resilience, develop stronger minds, stronger bodies through these physiological means, at the same time managing dysregulations and managing disorders on the medical side, right? So it's really how those two things can work together. Um, that's kind of where you see a lot of the success, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, we're mobile, we're flexible, we can, connect operators, clinicians with their patients across distance and geography fairly easily. We have very streamlined assessment, protocol creation, monitoring, treatment platforms, and really, the results that we're seeing over the last few years is, especially in the last 2 years, is that uh, operators, clinicians love our platform so much that they went from, on average, having somewhere between 6 to 8 remote patients in the beginning of 2023 to about 24 close to the
Wow.
end of 2024. So within 2 years, we're still wrapping up 24, so less than 2 years, we've managed to quadruple the number of remote patients or clients that are benefited from
Mm-hmm.
this modality of intervention with clinicians on
And for our
average.
viewers, just so they understand, all they need is a headset and a phone. Is that right? A mobile
Correct.
app on a phone to basically interact with the platform and do the training.
That's right. That's right. So the headset, I have one here. It looks something like this. We have multiple different
Oh
kinds
yeah,
of
I haven't seen
headsets.
this one. Looks like yeah, that looks much easier to use. From the history of doing this type of testing in the past, it was much more cumbersome to get the
Indeed.
brainwave readings, but this looks very easy. This looks even easier than what I saw before.
Maybe it's
So
time for an upgrade. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So
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 it's
yeah,
yeah,
that
very
that
simple.
is actually a very good point because if we look at the traditional neurofeedback devices, they're full of wires, they're full of you know
The goop.
complicated
You have to
stuff, the
yeah,
goop,
yeah,
all this does is it makes people not want to do it, right? It's so
yeah.
complicated and it takes forever to get the whole thing on. So, over the last few years, there's been significant improvement on, the device form factors. This is something that, you doctors are quite familiar with. When you look at old school EKG devices like the Philips monitoring stations, they're, huge. You can't take one of those home to monitor patients' heart rate. Whereas, we've got Apple Watches now, we've got Fitbit, we've got all these, consumer level devices that does a reliable enough job,
Mm-hmm.
albeit, Apple's not something you should rely on for medical diagnosis. But, the point is there are devices that can be good enough to look at heart rate, to look at EKG. Yet, you can walk around with it like a Holter monitor, right? So you can, and the same's happening for brainwaves for EEG. So we're really taking advantage of the advent of new, um, reliable devices that get really good EEG quality.
How does it catch the signals from the top of your head? Like, does it
Yeah,
need to through AI? It's being able to not doesn't need to do that.
No, so we have other devices for that. So we
Oh,
have
okay,
like
okay.
these, for example, one of my trainees who's been a trainee with me since June has one of these headsets. So I'll show you how that works. If you look at it's a
Oh
conventional
yeah.
North
Okay.
American baseball cap.
That's
So
baseball.
underneath, you mounted a single channel, so you can source localize. After source localizing where you want to get the EEG and train, you
Yeah.
can place the channel strategically where it needs to be
Yeah.
in order to source EEG easily and quickly from the right channel. So you can just
Mm-hmm.
mount the head and then you can put it on and you can hook up the reference to your ear and you can
Mm-hmm.
start training with the apparatus. So this device here in the back, which is the amplifier, connects with the app via Bluetooth. And while
Mm-hmm.
you're doing measurement or training, it's constantly feeding data to our app in real time. And the app calculates where you are in terms of your training based on a protocol definition, and it decides what level of rewards to issue at any given time, also in real time. So this is how people
Mm-hmm.
complete training. So, somebody can sit on their couch in their living room, train on their iPad, or if they want to, they can project that on their big screen TV and
Mm-hmm.
have the full visual auditory effect while doing neurofeedback training without having to leave their house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the value comes from. It's bringing in a modality like this that is super effective on a lot of um, dysregulations
So it's about 10 minutes a
that we
day.
see.
Like how much time does one need to do devote?
Yeah, it really depends. So, 10 minutes a day is a good starting point, right? So, for something like anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, like you probably want something between 10 to 20 minutes at minimum to start off with. So it's like going to the gym. You're developing resilience, right? So once, twice isn't gonna just magically make you better, but with consistency and guidance, you get
Mm-hmm.
gains within anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, and those
Mm-hmm.
gains can be sustainable, likely because you're changing the way your brain responds to different environment, to different situations or stimuli. So,
Mm-hmm.
on average, we see most people training somewhere around 20 minutes per session. Three to
Mm-hmm.
five sessions per week. That's
Okay.
one consecutive training interval, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a full spread, but mostly
Mm-hmm.
around 20 minutes, I would say. I've seen
Okay.
as long as an hour and as short as 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Can you take us through that? I mean, we've had one amazing success story. Maybe just take us through how they see it on the platform and what type of changes you saw in this gentleman.
Yes, certainly. Around summer, early summer this year, 2024, a lot of parents and a young gentleman coming and visiting my office. This young gentleman is in his early 20s and he's been struggling with persistent drug addiction as well as anxiety. So, we did a brain scan for him in the beginning of his journey, and we discovered there's some underlying biomarkers that suggested elevated sort of anxiety patterns as well as uh, these kind of patterns that suggest weakened regulation uh, functionalities or weakened self-regulation capabilities around the midbrain,
Mm-hmm.
and some high beta, which is also related to the expression of overvigilance and kind of like this very anxious type of
Mm-hmm.
behavior.
Just want to jump in there just for our viewers to understand this. So basically, the critical piece here is that we'll bring it back to the brainwave talk we had at the very beginning, but you had to do an assessment to understand what his pattern of brainwaves is. And that's not something that one can just do at their house. You have to kind of go in and have this done, right? By somebody understands how to look at the brainwaves and figure what is the pattern. Could it be a symptom or related to whatever symptoms the person's having? Is that
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
So it's
So yeah, so when you look at brain scans, and brain scans have always been done for different medical conditions like
mm-hmm.
concussion or epilepsy, right?
Yeah.
So they kind of look at EEG patterns and they try to associate different patterns and parents to patterns to
Mm-hmm.
specific expressions like epilepsy or
Mm-hmm.
concussion. And in this case, it's not that different. We look at certain markers. Um, when we say markers, those are fairly reliable patterns in brainwave that could be indicative to the
Mm,
presence of
mm,
certain expressions of dysregulation or maladaptiveness, right? So, for example, the midbrain high beta was a clear indicator that this gentleman has some overvigilance going on as a trait, because it was baseline, and then the inability to generate a specific amount of low beta uh, was indicative to the fact that there was a lot of shifting and mind wandering uh, as a consequence of sort of that anxiety caused by overvigilance and just not being able to focus calmly on one thing and constantly stay shift, which is a developed thing. So that was present and a lot of regular high beta patterns would put him on a poised protocol or
okay.
relaxed focus, as I like to call it. So we picked three frequency waves. We picked low beta, which is SMR. Remember SMR?
Mm-hmm.
So there's one and the same in the high beta and theta. So over the course of the last few months, since I think late June, he's been training with us. All this time, so about 5.5 months. He's trained pretty reliably almost every day. So we saw a lot of the data. We can kind of find and slice and dice the data from the beginning of his journey. So we can see from June to, let's say, September, where I know he went to. He was doing well enough to start university and taking a few courses that I
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
interested in. So that was remarkable because before that, it just the level of anxiety he was experiencing would be prohibitive, to that experience, right? And
Mm-hmm.
also, throughout the course of his training, we saw some significant improvement on some of these things. You see, like, there's reduction on high beta, uh, improvements on theta, which is his brain going into recovery, depending on
Mm-hmm.
the period. So he's low beta really oscillated quite a bit because some days he's just in the zone, other days he's not able to
Mm-hmm.
to sort of
Mm-hmm.
meet that. So you can track, how his training has been from, what's coming out of his brain. So we're trying to develop a robust sense of low beta or focus, regulatory function while reducing high beta. So we're relatively successful here reducing the high beta. And we're also tracking several key metrics that are derived from these frequencies. One is theta beta ratio. This is a fairly
Mm-hmm.
important metric. So you want this to stay in a pretty tight zone in order to prevent too much theta or too much high beta either way. So,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
sorry, mid beta.
Okay.
So you can see a lot of these outcomes as part of his training as he's doing them almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we also have questionnaires, inventories, because we knew that he confirmed himself that he was struggling with a heightened level of anxiety. So we dropped the GAD-7 questionnaire, which is part of the DSM-5 questionnaire inventory, specifically designed to measure generalized anxiety. Right.
Got
So
it.
7
Mm-hmm.
multiple choice questions. We score up every time he does the questions, we score up the outcome.
Yeah.
The higher you score, the worse. So we have a
Mm-hmm.
spectrum here from green to red to indicate, when the last time
Mm-hmm.
he did it and what was the outcome. So you can see, not surprisingly, he started out fairly anxious around the 19, or his peak was at 20 second week. And then
Mm-hmm.
as he started training, how anxiety really dropped precipitously, like within the first month or so. This is 4 weeks into the training. So his
Mm-hmm.
anxiety reduced from average 20-ish to about a 6. Rebounded a little bit as school started. And then he was quickly able to stabilize that around
Mm-hmm.
October. So
Okay.
stabilized around about a third of where he started off with. So this is really kind of the secondary proof or primary proof, depending on your perspective, um, that this is getting better. It's benefiting him. Uh, as a
Yeah.
tool that he's learning how to self-regulate. And I think he did anecdotally stay off the drugs. He stayed sober for, I think it was remarkably like 4.5 months or something like that,
And now he's
which
back
was
in full
the
time in university and doing very
amazing.
well, apparently.
Oh, that's
So
that's fantastic.
I think, yeah, obviously all this is backed up by, by evidence and what's happening in his life. It's definitely made a huge impact.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see how, this is just
Mm,
one of the anecdotal evidence. This is a
mm,
fairly simple protocol. We also had, mm, a calm protocol for him as well at the nighttime to
mm,
develop a sense of serenity and calmness to get rid of excessive ruminative
mm,
thoughts, promoting some of the slower frequency
mm,
bands and throttling high frequency bands, similar to this one. But, this is another example of state can become trait, right? So as somebody starts developing this consistency in training and they learn the
mm,
skill, they can apply that, in their day-to-day life, even without a headset on their head,
mm,
they can
mm.
kind of recall that calmness. So yeah, very
So
happy to see that this is a trainee that I've been training personally for quite a few months, and it's great to hear the progress is sustainable and it's done in a way that really is developing a life skill.
if there's somebody out there who's interested in learning more, potentially getting training done,
Yeah,
neurobiofeedback training, how would they reach to you? What's the best way to do that? What would you recommend?
they could take a look at our website, which is www.divergenceneuro.com.
Okay.
They can follow us at Divergence Neuro, which is Neuro
Mm-hmm.
Neuro at Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
My personal email is alex@divergenceneuro.com, so they can feel free to reach out to me. Once you land on our website, there's a general chat box. If you have a question, you can plop that into the chat box, and one of our team members will respond to your query
Mm-hmm.
within 24 hours, typically. So that's a good way to reach us.
And
Or
you'll
also,
direct them to where, if it's not you said yourself, but you'll direct them to the facilitators or trainers. Is that right? Who use the platform and can do the training for
that's
them.
correct. That's
Mm.
correct. We're just a software company,
Yeah.
so we're not in the sort of service provider business,
Right.
training clients directly, but we do have hundreds of clinicians and
Mm-hmm.
clinics today on our platform. So we're happy to, sort of refer them if they need a referral, find someone that's qualified nearby, then we're happy to do that
Mm-hmm.
referral if we know somebody that's nearby. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Anything new coming up in the platform or things that you're working on that you're excited about?
As we're wrapping up the year, we're really excited to introduce some of the newer modality of training as well as self-regulation techniques. So one of the most exciting parts is adding EKG into the mix. So EKG will get us heart rate, very accurate heart rate and HRV,
Mm-hmm.
which is really kind of heart rate variability, and it's a metric that got a lot of press coverage in recent years because of
Mm-hmm.
devices like Fitbit. What we're using is even more accurate modality of HRV coverage. So it's using electrical means rather than the photo optical means to
Mm.
collect the true EKG, not the PPG relying on photopolymeric kind of mechanism. So if you do the Fitbit mode, it's a bit rougher. So like the data
Mm-hmm.
isn't quite precise
Mm.
for down to the millisecond level, the peak to peak. Whereas with EKG, true EKG that's electrical in nature, you can get very precise. What that translates to is better measurement and better training algorithms that can
Mm-hmm.
use your real-time HRV component to improve your autonomous nervous system. So we're pretty excited about that. So you're going to see that coming on our platform very soon. We've launched a new device partner towards the end of the year that is excellent in doing EEG, EKG all in one device. So you have a
Mm-hmm.
wire that stretches down. You can put it right above your collarbone
Mm-hmm.
to get true EKG and then translate that into HRV using our algorithm and then use HRV as a training modality. So I think this really
Amazing.
is a powerful method because it gets you to effect even faster than EEG because you're really regulating your autonomous nervous
Hmm.
system, and that's the
Very
first thing you
interesting.
feel, right?
Sure.
And then you
Yeah.
can use EEG to consolidate those
Interesting.
habits by changing our brainwaves.
Hmm.
So it's a powerful way to combine the two in one. We're also working on some more interesting modalities of feedback, such as video games.
Hmm.
So right now we have YouTube videos, we have sound pieces. You can upload, your custom MP3s for your clients to enjoy. But in the not so distant future, we have video games coming out that are more engaging for younger audience to be interested. That's pretty exciting as well. So we've got lots of good new changes coming up.
That's amazing. Thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to put some of those links you mentioned of how to contact Divergence Neuro in the show notes. And I think we should, yeah, at some point we should probably talk about HRV. I'd like to do another deep dive into that if at some point with you. So that'd be really great.
Absolutely,
Awesome.
and it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show again. It's great to see you again.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast with Alex Nee from Divergence Neuro. The contact information for how to reach him is in the show notes. And we learned all about brainwaves, how we can train those brainwaves. We learned about operant conditioning. And if you think that you could benefit from this, which I think almost everybody can, please contact them, contact me, and we'll get you set up for some training. I think it's really one of those non-drug ways to get your brain into top performance. All right, if you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe, share it with all your friends and family. This helps us get the word out. Okay, talk later. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed today's podcast and you felt you learned something that can help you on your journey, please hit subscribe, like, and I'd love it if you'd share this with a friend who you think would also benefit and get inspired. And leave us a review. We're always looking for feedback on how to deliver more value to you. So take care. Until next time, I'm Dr. G from Peak Human Labs Podcast.